The prairie chapel stood against the sky like a memory too proud to fall. Sunlight spilled across the dry, cracked earth, bathing the wooden steps in a gold that felt more farewell than celebration. Inside, the air smelled faintly of flowers, left too long in the sun. And there she was, Eloise, wrapped in cream-colored lace, still and waiting, her hands folded around a bouquet no one had thought to water. The whispers had already started. First a murmur from the pews, then a shifting of boots, the creak of wood under restless anticipation turning to discomfort. Time passed, not as minutes, but as slow drips of disbelief. The groom never came, not with an apology, not with shame, not with anything at all. Just absence, and that was worse than cruelty. Eloise didn't cry. That would have granted the moment more power than it deserved. She blinked once, slowly, as though she'd merely forgotten something on the stove. Then she turned. Her shoes tapped lightly against the worn floorboards as she walked down the aisle alone, past the pitying faces and unsure nods, her chin raised not in pride, but in refusal to collapse. She walked out into the wind, where the sun had already begun to lower itself behind the ridge, spilling its last bit of warmth on the town of Barlow Ridge. Thomas Calder watched from the back pew, hat in hand, eyes shadowed beneath the brim. His son, Caleb, sat beside him, legs too short to reach the floor, arms wrapped tightly around himself. The boy hadn't spoken in nearly a year, not since his mother passed the winter before last, quietly, in her sleep, with no grand exits or farewells, just one breath, then no more. Thomas didn't understand what made him stay that afternoon. Maybe it was habit, maybe something quieter, older. The weight in Eloise's eyes had felt familiar. He knew something of waiting for someone who would never come. Eloise took a room above McKinley's dry goods. It was modest, with a bed like a prayer and curtains that smelled of cedar. No one had lived in it for years. The landlady, Miss Hortense, had muttered something about bad luck and being too late for new beginnings, but Eloise had only smiled and said she'd take it. She unpacked slowly, one dress for Sunday, a Bible with frayed corners, a silver locket with nothing inside, and a small, weathered book of poems. Her past had packed light. It knew it wasn't welcome here. At the edge of town stood the Calder homestead, where fields turned stubborn in the dry wind and the barn leaned slightly east as though tired of standing. Thomas worked the forge behind the house. He shaped iron the way some men prayed, with sweat, with silence, with hope that it might mean something. He raised Caleb as best he could, speaking only when needed, loving in quiet ways. Toast without crust. Boots repaired without being asked. A presence, steady and unmoving. That night, while the rest of the town recounted the day's quiet scandal, over supper and whiskey, Thomas stood on the porch watching the moon rise. Caleb was asleep, curled up in the old rocker wrapped in his mother's quilt. Thomas lit a match, struck it against the edge of the railing, and let it burn down, till it bit his skin. He didn't flinch. Something about the woman who had walked alone from her own wedding lingered like smoke. Not pity, not attraction, just recognition. He knew what it meant to keep walking when there was nothing left to walk toward. 2 days passed. Eloise visited the chapel again, not to pray, but to sit. Her veil had been packed away, and her hair now hung in a loose braid down her back. The priest said little when she arrived, and less when she left. He was a kind man, but kindness doesn't mend what silence breaks. The townfolk spoke of her in undertones. She was too old for romance, too proud to beg, too plain to start again. No one said it cruelly. They said it like weather, just something that was. But Thomas saw the way she wiped her hands on her skirt after leaving the bakery, even though there was no flour. He noticed how she offered to help old Mr. Linder across the street even when he waved her off. And he watched as she sat alone on the bench near the smithy, reading aloud to no one. Caleb, quiet as ever, sometimes watched her from the window. Once, he slipped a small wooden horse from his pocket and placed it in the dirt near the bench. Eloise found it later that evening. She didn't return it. She just smiled and set it beside her book. The forge stayed hot that week, orders piling in as if work could distract from what the heart refused to name. Thomas burned through horseshoes and hinges, pausing only to sip water and watch the trail that led through town. Then came the rain. Sudden, unexpected. A thunderhead rolled in with the fury of a past grievance. It drenched the fields and turned the main road to mud. Lightning cracked through the distant hills, and winds battered shutters like fists on doors. That night, Thomas rode into town to check on supplies. As he passed the chapel, he saw her, Eloise, standing outside with her arms around herself, hair soaked, dress clinging to her legs like an afterthought. Her umbrella had broken in the wind. He dismounted without thinking. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't speak, didn't thank him, just met his gaze with something fragile but unbroken. He said, in a voice as low as the clouds above, that he had a home. Not far. Dry roof, spare bed. For Caleb's sake, he added. Could use a steady hand around the house. Nothing more. Nothing expected. Eloise paused. She looked up at the chapel. Behind her, then down at the road ahead. She didn't ask why, she only asked where. They rode in silence, save for the sound of hooves splashing through the softened earth. At the Calder home, the fireplace burned low. Caleb stood in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He said nothing when he saw her, just watched. Eloise stepped inside without hesitation, water pooling around her boots. Thomas lit another lamp. Eloise bent to greet the boy, who took a step back, but not away. That was enough. She slept in the room where Thomas's sister had stayed briefly, years ago. The bed was stiff, the walls thin, but the silence that filled them was softer than she'd known in years. The next morning, she made coffee. Black, strong, unsweetened. She cooked eggs and toast, setting 3 plates instead of 2. Thomas ate without comment. Caleb picked at the toast, then took a bite of egg. No one said a word. But something in the room shifted, less like a beginning, more like a breath held too long finally released. Outside, the rain had left the ground clean, the air quiet. Eloise opened the door and stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand. She looked out over the ridge where the sun was just starting to rise, spreading gold across the wet earth like a promise, whispered too softly to be heard. Behind her, Thomas cleared his throat. She turned. Their eyes met, and for a moment, nothing needed to be said. The wind passed between them like something ancient and kind. It was not love, not yet, but it was something, and that, at last, was enough. The desert wind carried secrets in its breath that evening, whistling low through the crooked fence posts of Barlow Ridge and tugging gently at the veil of a bride, who no longer had need for ceremony. Eloise Whitmore stood alone beneath the splintered arch of wildflowers, her shadow stretching long across the dry churchyard earth, her bouquet wilting faster than hope. The wooden chapel behind her still hummed with murmurs, stifled coughs, uncomfortable shifting, the faint creak of pews holding more silence than sound. No one had spoken her name in the last half hour. No one dared to. A few women wiped their eyes politely, not because they knew her sorrow, but because public heartbreak required ritual. The men mostly avoided her gaze. Only the children, squirming in their Sunday boots, watched with barefaced awe, unaware that they were witnessing something sacred and strange. A woman abandoned in full bloom, still standing. She didn't cry. Not once. Instead, she turned. Slowly, deliberately, like someone who had known for days this moment might come. The sun caught the silver beginning to thread her hair, lit the faint bruises time had left near her collarbone, little betrayals of youth, and proof that she was not the girl the town had hoped to see married. The man who had promised her forever, never even sent word. Eloise walked past the rows of whispers and through the heavy church doors, her satin shoes silent against the steps. The preacher offered her a hand as she passed, but she only gave him a nod so faint it nearly broke his heart. On the dusty street outside, the wind picked up, sweeping dry leaves into a slow dance. A horse nickered near the hitching post. The town clock rang 4, then 5, then fell silent. The world, it seemed, had moved on, but Thomas Calder had not. He watched her from a respectful distance, his son Caleb perched on his hip, both of them shadowed by the eaves of the smithy barn. Thomas had come only out of obligation. He'd made the horseshoe fittings for the would-be groom's wedding party. He hadn't expected to stay. But when he saw Eloise step through that doorway alone, chin lifted like a banner of quiet resistance, something in his chest shifted. It wasn't pity. It wasn't desire. It was recognition. Thomas knew what it meant to lose something that had never fully belonged to you. It had been 15 months since his wife passed, 12 since he buried her in the soft hillside above their farm. Her illness had come quick and cruel, like a fire in winter. She'd left behind her favorite apron, her half-finished quilt, and Caleb, who had not spoken a full sentence since. Eloise, they said, had come from the east. Not quite young anymore, not quite old. Just overlooked. Her letters had been steady, polite, proper. The man she'd written to had chosen her. The town of Barlow Ridge was a place where silence carried farther than words, and where the past hung heavier than the dust in the air. It watched people the way old trees did, quietly, without blinking, letting them grow crooked if they needed to. It didn't take long for tongues to twitch and eyes to narrow once folks learned that Eloise Whitmore was now staying up at the Calder place. No wedding band, no minister's blessing, no town meeting to nod it along. Just a woman whose heart had been cracked open in public, now tending to the home of a man whose grief had grown roots. At the general store, Mrs. Ellsworth muttered behind her canned peaches that it wasn't right. At the saloon, boys with tobacco-stained teeth snickered into their whiskey. Even the preacher, who fancied himself a shepherd of understanding, hesitated when he saw Eloise at Sunday service. Alone, seated at the very back, her gloves folded neatly in her lap. But Eloise did not explain. And Thomas did not apologize. He had not invited her as a lover, nor asked her to stay as a housekeeper. It had simply happened, the way rain sometimes falls without warning, and the parched earth drinks without question. One night turned to 3 to 7. Soon she was part of the morning ritual, feeding the chickens, folding Caleb's shirts, listening to the slow rhythm of Thomas's hammer on the anvil while she patched old curtains in the shade of the porch. At first, Thomas kept his distance. The forge gave him reason enough to vanish into sweat and smoke. But each evening, after Caleb was asleep and the prairie had quieted to a hush, they found themselves drawn to the same spot. The step beneath the kitchen window where they'd watched the stars begin their slow climb across the ink-blue sky. Their conversations were spare, like sparse trees in a wind-blown field, meaningful only for their presence. He asked once if she missed the city. She smiled a little, more with her eyes than her lips, and said nothing. She asked if his son always had such quiet eyes. He looked at the horizon for a long time before answering that Caleb used to hum when he played with toy horses. Used to sing without knowing the tune. And then one day he just stopped. Sometimes that's what grief did. It didn't roar. It just silenced you. Eloise knew the shape of silence. Hers had come not from death, but dismissal. Years spent being told she was sensible instead of lovely, practical instead of desired. She had made peace with solitude. It had become her skin. But living in a house with Thomas and Caleb was like being asked gently to molt. The boy began to soften first, not in speech. He still hadn't uttered a word, but in presence. He started trailing behind her in the mornings, watching how she braided the horse's mane, how she chopped herbs for stew. He would sit on the floor while she read books aloud, though his eyes rarely met hers. Then one late afternoon, a storm rolled in again, fierce and sudden, lashing against the windows with old fury. Thomas was still at the forge. Eloise found Caleb hiding beneath the kitchen table, knees drawn to his chest, eyes wide and hollow. She crawled under the table too, her dress catching on the bench leg, and sat beside him in the darkness. She did not speak. She just reached out and let her hand rest, soft and warm, near his. Minutes passed. The thunder rumbled. Wind cried through the cracks in the walls, and then, like a ghost brushing past, Caleb's small fingers slipped into hers. That night, when Thomas returned, soaked and weary, he found them both asleep by the hearth. Eloise's hand still wrapped around the boy's, and the kind of peace on her face that looked like something reclaimed. It stirred something in him. Not romantic, not yet, but a reverence, a recognition. Eloise wasn't filling the hole left by his wife. She was becoming something else entirely. Still, the town did not understand. One morning, the door swung open, and Miss Tilly Braxton marched in, rosy cheeks, quick breath, nerves masked by righteousness. She'd taught at the schoolhouse 2 years before Eloise. Meant well, mostly. She sat at the Calder kitchen table without invitation and fixed Eloise with a stare that tried for pity but missed. "People are talking," she said. Eloise poured her tea without blinking. "They think it's improper. A widow and a spinster, living together, under one roof, without vows, without promise." Eloise folded a dish towel with measured grace. Her voice came soft, but iron-lined. "Let them talk." Miss Braxton flushed. "You could have someone else, you know, a proper life. You're not too far gone." Eloise turned her eyes toward the woman, and something in her gaze, deep, unshaken, sorrowful and sovereign, made Tilly stop short. "I already have a life," Eloise said, "and it's not yours to measure." When Tilly left, Thomas had been outside the window, hearing every word. He said nothing that day, just handed Eloise a cup of coffee later than evening, steam curling like forgiveness between them. But from that day forward, he stood a little closer, spoke a little longer, looked at her not as someone helping, but as someone staying. Caleb, meanwhile, had begun humming again, just under his breath, just enough that it might have been imagined. But Eloise knew music when she heard it. Even broken tunes have truth in them. Weeks passed. The harvest came late that year, and the well needed mending. One morning, Thomas climbed down to inspect the cracks in the lower lining. The rope ladder swayed. Caleb watched from the porch, and Eloise stood beside him, clutching the spindle rail. It happened fast. A board near the lip gave way. A jagged edge caught Thomas's forearm as he slipped. Not far, not dangerous, but the sound of his fall, the shout, the sudden snap of rope, sent Caleb into a stillness so deep Eloise feared he'd vanished inside himself again. She dropped to her knees beside him, turning his face gently toward hers. "He's all right," she whispered. "He's all right, Caleb." The boy stared at the well, unblinking, and then just barely. "Pa." The word was small, rough-edged, like a stone pulled from deep mud, but it was there. Eloise's breath caught. Caleb said it again, louder. "Pa!" From below, Thomas called back. "I'm fine, son." Caleb bolted toward the edge, tears running rivers down his cheeks, crying out again and again, "Pa! Pa! Pa!" Thomas climbed out, bruised but grinning, and gathered the boy into his arms. Caleb sobbed, into his shirt, his voice cracked but alive, repeating the word like a litany. Eloise stood back, trembling. Something had shifted, not in one moment but over weeks, now only revealed because the silence had broken. Later, after Caleb had fallen asleep on Thomas's shoulder, Thomas walked her to the porch. The moon hung low, a silver coin in a bruised sky. He turned to her, voice low. "You didn't fix him." Eloise looked down. "No, you saw him." That was enough. They stood there for a while, and though neither said the words, something between them folded inward, sacred and silent. Not love. Not yet, but something beginning. Something the town couldn't name, and therefore could never ruin. And perhaps that was enough. For now. The days folded into one another like linen pressed in a cedar chest, quiet, warm, and lined with the faint scent of something older than memory. Autumn settled slow over Barlow Ridge. The wind grew gentler, the sun a little more tired. Out, on the Calder homestead, pumpkins ripened along the fence line, and the wheat bowed like it too, had learned to be humble. Eloise moved through the house like a second breath. There was no role named for what she'd become. She was not wife, nor servant, nor guest. She was something quieter, something steadier, the kind of presence that stitched holes without being asked, that poured a second cup of coffee before. Yours was empty, that sang lullabies not because she'd had children, but because someone should. Caleb had begun to laugh again, in bursts like startled sparrows. He trailed after Eloise now with a stick horse and 1,000 questions, not in words but in gestures. She taught him how to grind cinnamon bark, how to listen to a horse's hooves for signs of fatigue, how to read the clouds like pages of sky-written scripture. Each lesson was given in glances, in touches, in the warm hush between spoken things. Thomas watched from the forge, from behind his hammer and smoke. The blacksmith in him understood heat and pressure, how fire softened even iron. And still, he was not ready to name what was happening inside his ribs when he saw her brush the hair from Caleb's brow, or when he caught the lilt of her hum through the window just before dusk. Love, he knew, was not loud. It was not always thunder. Sometimes it came as a presence too consistent to be noticed at first, like the way grass always grew back after winter. One evening, as the sky peeled open with stormlight, Thomas knocked softly on the kitchen door before stepping inside, though it was his house, and he hadn't knocked on his own door in years. Eloise looked up from her stitching, brows gently arched. "You all right?" He nodded, then shook his head, then tried again. "I was thinking," he said, "there's a fair coming through town. Next Saturday. Caleb's never been. I thought maybe you'd come." She studied him, that quiet way she had, eyes soft, searching, but not pressing. Then she nodded once. All right, and that was that. The fair bloomed like color across the towns. Modest square, painted booths, strings of bunting, pies with crusts golden as morning. There was music, laughter, and the soft chaos of a dozen children weaving through their elders like minnows in a brook. Caleb clutched Eloise's hand tight, his eyes wide as full moons. Thomas walked beside them, not close enough to touch, but never drifting far. The three of them, a shape not yet named, moved through the fair as if testing the world's permission to be what they were becoming. Eloise won a jar of lavender honey at the bean toss. Caleb fed an apple to a miniature pony and whispered something only the pony could hear. Thomas bought 3 pieces of lemon candy and gave 2 away. Then, as evening pulled its shawl over the sky, Caleb tugged at Thomas's sleeve and pointed toward the carousel, a creaking painted thing that moved in slow, graceful circles. Wooden horses with chipped manes. Music that sounded like an old memory. Thomas hesitated. "You sure?" Caleb nodded, holding his hand tight. Eloise stepped beside them, and without needing to ask, the 3 climbed onto the platform. Caleb chose a spotted horse. Eloise sat beside him, steadying his grip. Thomas leaned against the center pole, watching them go round. And something happened. Not loud, not seen. But something in Thomas cracked, not like glass, but like soil after drought. His heart let something in. Afterward they sat on the hill above town, where lanterns flickered below like earthbound stars. Caleb had fallen asleep in Eloise's lap, his face still rosy from wind and sugar. Thomas looked at her, at the woman who'd been left behind at an altar, who'd stepped into his home like she was born to soften hard things. "Why did you say yes?" he asked. "To you. To coming here." Eloise brushed a strand of hair from Caleb's forehead, slow and gentle. "Because I was tired of waiting for permission to live." Thomas swallowed. "And me?" "You were tired of drowning." Their eyes met, and then a silence passed between them, not empty, but full, as if both were hearing the same song from across a long, long distance. In the weeks that followed, the world didn't change, but the way it sounded did. People in town still whispered, but they whispered less. A few brought pies. One offered firewood. Miss Tilly even sent a letter apologizing for her uncharitable visit. But life, true life, happened not in town, but in the quiet moments. One morning, Thomas caught a fever. Nothing terrible, just enough to flatten him. Eloise tended him with herbs and water wrapped in snow. Caleb brought wildflowers and whispered stories to the edge of the bed. Thomas, half dreaming, half burning, reached for her hand once and didn't let go. She didn't pull away. Another time a coyote took one of the hens, and Thomas cursed loud enough to make the barn shudder. But before he could grab his rifle, Eloise stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "It's hungry, same as us," she said. They left food out the next night. No more hens were taken. Still, even slow rivers find rocks. One morning a stranger came to town, slick-haired, city-suited, teeth too white for dust country. His name was Mr. Bradley Monroe. He walked with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. He claimed to be a land scout, but his eyes clung to Eloise in a way Thomas didn't like. They met by chance outside the millinery. "Miss Whitmore." The man said, "I do believe we're owed a conversation." Eloise's spine straightened. She stepped in front of Caleb without thinking. "We're not," she said. "Oh, but we are. You left in such a rush, I never got the chance to explain." "There's nothing to explain." Thomas stepped out of the mercantile then, eyes narrowing. He didn't speak, just stood beside her. Monroe smiled, thin as a knife. "Well, seems you found yourself quite the protector." Thomas didn't smile back. "You should leave." The man looked between them, at the child gripping Eloise's hand, at the man made of iron and restraint, and the woman who had once said yes to a man like him because she hadn't known she could want more. He tipped his hat. "Enjoy your quiet life." He never came back. That night, as wind curled like ribbon through the eaves, Thomas knocked on Eloise's door. When she opened it, he didn't step inside, just stood in the hallway, hat in hand. "I didn't ask you to stay," he said. "I know, and I haven't said thank you." She looked at him, her eyes the color of memory. "You didn't need to. Still, I should have." He hesitated. "I want you to know. I see you, not as someone who patched a hole, or soothed a boy, or made the place warm again, but as someone I'd want beside me, even if I had no holes left to fill." Eloise's breath trembled. "And I'd still choose this," she said, "even if no one had ever left me at that altar." Thomas stepped forward. "You're not too old." She smiled, slow. "True, neither are you." They stood there, the quiet deep between them. Not lovers, not yet, but no longer strangers orbiting grief. The storm hadn't passed, but they were no longer weathering it alone. And somewhere down the hall, a child dreamed of horses that never got tired. Snow came late that year, soft as breath and quiet as regret. It dusted the land in the hush before dawn, turning the hills silver and the fields to memory. The forge stood silent that morning, its mouth cold, its coals unlit. Thomas Calder, for the first time in years, had stayed in bed past sunrise. Eloise stirred early, as she always did. She'd learned the rhythm of the house, where the stairs creaked, how the kettle sighed. She'd taken to mending by the window, the light there most forgiving. Her fingers were nimble even now, even after everything they'd carried. But that morning something was wrong. Caleb had come to her room whispering that his papa wasn't waking easy, that he'd tried to shake him, gentle-like, and he'd just mumbled something and turned over, face hot and wet with sweat. Eloise was calm, but inside her chest a small, sharp worry began to bloom. She found Thomas half lost to fever, caught in the rift between now and somewhere else. He called her name without knowing he had, whispered apologies to ghosts he thought she couldn't hear. She pressed cool cloths to his brow, whispered back promises he wouldn't remember. The doctor came, dust-covered and sour-eyed from the ride. He left behind 2 vials and 3 words: "Keep him warm." Eloise did more than that. She lit every fire, filled the house with orange light, told Caleb stories she half remembered from her own childhood, ones her mother used to tell with braided hair and herbal tea. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside, time slowed. Thomas drifted in and out. In the space between waking and sleeping, he murmured things he never would have said in daylight. "I was afraid you'd leave," he whispered once. "I didn't think I deserved more." Eloise sat beside him, her fingers around his, her voice steady. "You don't have to deserve it. You just have to be brave enough to let it stay." Then came the night when the wind howled like something grieving. The fire sputtered once, then caught again, stubborn and low. Caleb lay curled on a cot by the hearth, Eloise beside Thomas's bed, eyes heavy. Thomas stirred. His breathing had steadied, the flush in his cheeks now faint. When he opened his eyes, they were clearer than they'd been in days. "You stayed," he said, voice raw. "Of course I did." He looked at her, really looked. And then his hand found hers, not reaching, not taking, just holding, like 2 rivers touching where their banks gave way. "You once said you were tired of waiting for permission to live." She nodded, tears silent. "I've been waiting too, not for life, for someone to see me, the whole of me. Not the blacksmith, not the widower, just me." "You deserve that," she said, "and you deserve to be more than someone's second chance." They sat in the quiet, The wind outside softened. "Marry me," he said, "but don't say yes yet." She blinked. "Marry me in spring, when the ground gives again. Not because we're lonely, not to fix what's broken, but because we've built something from the slow burn of kindness, from the quiet." Eloise let the silence stretch. Then she pressed his hand to her cheek. "Only if Caleb gives his blessing." Thomas smiled, eyes wet. "He already calls you home." When Thomas healed, he healed fully. His body knew now what it meant to be fought for. The days turned gentler. The snow, once heavy, melted into earth that remembered warmth. Caleb laughed more. His footsteps no longer echoed lonely. He'd taken to sleeping near their rooms, like the hush of their voices through thin walls comforted him more than lullabies. One afternoon a letter came. It was from the same town that had once left Eloise at the altar. It was from her sister. We heard about the boy, about the blacksmith. There was no malice in it, just quiet curiosity wrapped in caution. You could come home. You could still make a different life. Eloise folded the letter slowly. She sat with it a long time, the way one might sit with a dream that used to mean something but no longer fits. That evening, she told Thomas. He listened. He always did. Then he said softly, "That's not your home anymore, is it?" She shook her head. "It was never mine to begin with. Spring brought wildflowers and mud. It brought bees and the soft flutter of laundry in the breeze. And it brought an old suit from the cedar trunk, a dress of faded lace with new seams and mended hems. They married under the cottonwood tree. There were no guests, just witnesses." Caleb held the rings in a velvet pouch he refused to let go of. The preacher was the same one who had buried Thomas's wife. He smiled the whole time. When Thomas said "I do," his voice didn't shake. When Eloise did, her eyes never left his. It was not a fairy tale. It was something better. That night Thomas told her a story. "When my wife died," he said, "I thought my story ended there, that I'd had my chance and all that was left was dust and doing my best for the boy. But then you showed up, wearing sorrow like a badge and strength like skin. And I realized, some stories don't end. They just find a new chapter." Eloise kissed him slow. "Then let's write it well," she whispered. And they did, not with grand gestures, but with small sacred rituals. Coffee in the morning, shared glances over supper, teaching Caleb how to read, how to plant carrots, how to say "I'm sorry" when you mean it. There was one more storm. Late summer, a fire out near the West Hills. Thomas went to help. All the able men did. Eloise stayed, behind with Caleb. But when word came that one of the wagons had been caught, flames sudden, unpredictable, she didn't wait. She saddled the horse and rode into the smoke like someone who had lost enough in this life and refused to lose more. She found him, not burned, but pinned, leg twisted under a fallen beam. The others had gone ahead to fetch help. When he saw her, he tried to speak. She pressed her hand to his mouth. "Don't you dare apologize." Together, with strength born of every wound they had carried, they lifted the beam just enough. She pulled him free. Later, as they rode home, Thomas said, "You came for me." She looked at him, eyes fierce. "Of course I did." That night, lying in the dark, he turned to her. "What if the fire had taken me? It didn't. But if it had, then I would have kept you alive in every story Caleb ever told." He was quiet a moment. "You've become," his mother Eloise blinked. She hadn't known how much she needed to hear it. "And you've become my peace," she said. They kissed then, Not out of passion, but out of knowing, out of the slow, aching truth that sometimes love doesn't crash in. It arrives like morning, gradual, inevitable, and full of light. So if you ever find yourself on the edge of something lost, if you ever wonder if it's too late, remember the woman once called too old, and the man who thought his heart had hardened, and the boy who found both, a mother and a reason to laugh again. Their story wasn't loud, but it was true. And in the end, what more could anyone ask for? To the kind soul watching this story from wherever you are, if this tale touched something in you, if it reminded you that love, no matter how long it takes, can still bloom, let us know. Like the video, leave a comment, and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. Until next time, may your days be steady and your nights full of peace.